Giving a death count in Gaza is a contentious issue. The Hamas-run Health Ministry in the territory has been offering figures since the beginning of the war, and international organizations, including the United Nations, as well as media organizations, often rely on them as they are seen as the best available. But as the figures rise, the task of documenting the deaths is becoming more difficult and more disputed. Our report assesses the changing process of counting the dead in this conflict.
In the war in Gaza, only one institution has been providing a detailed death toll, the territory's health ministry, which is overseen by Hamas. The ministry collects data from hospitals and regularly updates a central list, including not only the name, sex, and age of the victim, but also their personal identification number whenever possible. Multiple independent studies have shown this list to be trustworthy. In January of this year, even Israeli intelligence confirmed that the Gazan Health Ministry's count roughly matched their own estimates, although they remain skeptical of how many casualties are combatants and how many civilians. But now, as the war drags on, counting the dead has become more difficult and has led to renewed accusations from Israel that the figures are unreliable. With more than 3 out of 4 hospitals damaged or destroyed, the traditional system for establishing a casualty list has all but collapsed. More and more Hamas authorities are using on-the-ground media reports and eyewitness testimony to count bodies. Over 30% of the health ministry's death toll now consists of unidentified individuals. And yet, even as Israeli authorities draw attention to the increasingly poor quality of data, some independent analysts say the Gaza death toll could be vastly underestimated. A study published earlier in July in the medical journal The Lancet claimed that at least 186,000 Palestinians had most likely died as a result of the Israeli bombing and ground offensive in Gaza. A clearer picture of the death and destruction will likely emerge after the fighting is over and a nonpartisan investigation is allowed to take place.
Michael Spaggett is a professor at the Royal Holloway University of London and chair of Every Casualty Counts, an NGO that is committed to ensure that victims in armed conflicts are recorded, recognized, and remembered. Welcome to DW. It's great to have you on the show. Now, Michael, according to the latest figures published last night by the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza, over 39,000 people have been killed since the war began 9 months ago. How reliable is this number?
So I would say that that's a plausible number, but it consists, as your report said, of 2 components, and one component is actually much more credible than the other component. I should say that just yesterday, the Ministry of Health released another detailed list of victims that has 28,185 on it, and that comes from their morgue-based monitoring system, plus a form that people can fill out reporting deaths that they know about. So I view that 28,185 as a highly credible rock bottom minimum. The other bit of it, essentially 10,000 additional deaths that bring you up to the figure that you just mentioned, is really a black box, and they've never explained where that comes from. They say that it's based on reliable media reports, but they've never actually published those reports, or even a methodology for how they go about compiling them.
Yeah, and I want to talk about methodology because other studies estimate that the number of deaths in Gaza could be multiple times higher than those 39,000 that we were just talking about. How do you explain this enormous difference?
Well, really, that letter, I won't even call it a study because it's really more of a joke than a study. I mean, that letter is just not a serious piece of work. But they're tapping into something that is real, which is that there are some deaths that are not directly caused by the conflict in a violent way. So that's true. There are going to be some deaths like that, but where that number comes from is really just not serious in any way. That they just took 13 other conflicts, none of which really resembles very closely the Gaza conflict, and then they used some very poor measurements for indirect deaths caused in those conflicts, and then they said, well, if Gaza kind of looks like what happened in those 13 very dissimilar conflicts, then there could be this huge number of deaths. It's not serious, and people should just ignore it. I've got a whole article about this, by the way.
Yeah, that is some very, very important context you're giving us there. I really appreciate that. I'd like to focus for a minute on the Israeli government's perspective and play a clip from Prime Minister Netanyahu speaking yesterday at the U.S. Congress and then return to you.
That's why, despite all the lies you've heard, the war in Gaza has one of the lowest ratios of combatants to non-combatants casualties in the history of urban warfare. And you want to know where it's lowest in Gaza? It's lowest in Rafah.
Michael, is there any evidence whatsoever for the claims being made there by Prime Minister Netanyahu?
No, that's just ridiculous. What he's saying. He also said apparently that there are virtually no civilian deaths in Rafah. I can tell you, based on the latest detailed list of deaths that was released by the Ministry of Health yesterday, that since the Rafah invasion began, there were recorded by the Ministry of Health, which, as you pointed out, has an imperfect monitoring system right now, but they still managed to record about 3,500 new deaths. And of those, 1,656 were children under the age of 15. So it's not anywhere near as clean as he is trying to make it out to be.
Yeah, and back in May, Benjamin Netanyahu himself put the number of deaths in the Gaza Strip at 30,000, saying back then that 14,000 of them were said to be combatants, which would leave 16,000 civilians. But let's look beyond the fighting that is happening right now, because once the guns fall silent, what will have to be done to establish the real picture and for us to know the true toll of this war?
This is going to be a major project that is going to take probably a decade or more to complete. We have an excellent starting point, fortunately, here, which are those detailed lists that the Ministry of Health has been releasing. Those lists are imperfect. They have many flaws in them. I've written a series of articles that puts a lot of effort into exposing flaws in those lists, but we must not lose sight of the big picture that those lists are really a gold mine of information, and all subsequent work is going to build on that. But it's going to take a long time. It's going to be a major project, but I'm confident that this is something that is going to happen, and I'm confident that eventually we're going to have a very clear picture of the death toll, both civilian and non-civilian, in Gaza.
We talk a lot about numbers here, but your organization precisely strives to recognize every death from armed conflict as an individual human tragedy. How is that possible under the current circumstances in Gaza?
Well, the scale of it is so vast that you can't really give every individual his or her due. I mean, not even close. But really, I think that the place to start is by listing each person killed by name and then trying to say something about each one of those individuals. And when I referred to a project that will happen when the fighting finally stops, that will take at least a decade, this is going to be a central part of it, that we want to produce as complete a list as possible of the people who have been killed. And then we want to know something about each one, the circumstances of their deaths, who they were. But of course, no human can keep all of that information in their mind because it's so large. But there have been a number of projects that attempt to do this. And it's an important undertaking, and we absolutely must do it for Gaza.
That was Michael Spagat, chair of Every Casualty Counts. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Pleased to be here.